Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GODAN Webinar. On behalf of the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to a webinar series. Today, we have a very excellent webinar planned on the topic of mapping data ecosystems. And this webinar will be presented by colleagues from CABI and ODI, Ruthie, Musker, and Josh Diadaro. This is a very important and interesting webinar, and I'm looking forward to hearing from both colleagues on what they are doing in this area. And I also want to welcome all of you who are joining us for this webinar from all around the world. So big welcome to all of you. I would like to inform you to please use the chat window, which you can see on the side of your screens, to ask your questions. You can type in the questions in the chat window, and once the webinar is finished, we will go through the questions one by one and answer the questions and give the opportunity for the presenters to answer your questions. So now I would like to hand over to the presenters, Josh Diadaro from the Open Data Institute and Ruthie Musker from CABI to introduce this topic to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suchith, for that lovely introduction, and hello to everyone in the attendance. So as Suchith said, today we will be talking about mapping data ecosystems. Not sure how familiar everyone is with here, but hopefully I'll be able to take you through a nice introduction and show you some excellent examples. So the broad agenda, so we'll kind of talk about who we are. I'll introduce myself and Ruthie. What is ecosystem mapping and why it could be useful? We'll look at how people map their own data ecosystems, and then we go into a bit of a Q&A. So starting off, I don't know if anyone is very knowledgeable about the ODI. We were founded in 2012, and we're an international independent not-for-profit organization. We're based in London. We were founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, and Sir Nigel Shadbolt, sort of one of the pioneers of AI, and our CEO is Dr. Jenny Tennyson. So some introductions for ourselves. My name is Josh Diadaro. I'm a consultant at the ODI. I've been working here for over a year and a half, and in the technology space more broadly for over 5 years. And I'm the leader of the sort of data ecosystem mapping product here at the ODI. I've been working with the Gates Foundation and CABI on a variety of international development and agricultural data projects, and data ecosystem mapping has been a big part of that. Ruthie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Josh. I'm sorry about the presentation. I didn't have a photograph of myself. My name is Ruthie Musker. I am a project manager at CABI. I might know some of you in the audience from my previous role as strategic projects lead in GODAN. So it's good to be back. Hello, everyone. And I've been managing a project on behalf of CABI funded by the Gates Foundation, looking at data sharing and access in India and Ethiopia. And we've had tremendous success using the data ecosystem mapping process and working together with the ODI on that. And I'll share a little bit more about that later on in the webinar.
Great, thanks, Ruthie. So brief introduction on the ODI. So we have our mission is quite clear. We work with companies and governments to build an open and trustworthy data ecosystem. And our vision is that we want people, organizations, and communities to use data to make better decisions and be protected from any harmful impacts. So moving on to the topic at hand, why are we here today? So the purpose of today's webinar is to explore why we map data ecosystems, to understand the use of personas in data ecosystems, and to understand how we've been using them in projects both for ourselves and how you might do it in a workshop or solo setting as well. First thing we'd like to talk about at the ODI is how we conceive data. So we look at data on a spectrum of openness, moving from closed data, which may be sensitive company data such as employment contracts and policies, to shared data, so that could be medical research that's shared within a scientific or academic community, to open data, so that is data that is openly licensed, anyone can use, access, or share it. So we'll be getting into fair data a bit as well, which could be across the spectrum. but this is just sort of our typical ODI terminology. So how do we see data? So a lot of people will say data is oil, data is this, data is that. Our conjecture is that data is infrastructure. We see it similarly to roads and bridges. It's a critical part of how our society and economy functions, and something that we need to invest in, plan, and maintain, just as we would roads, bridges, and other infrastructure in the real world. All these types of infrastructure in the real world works better when it's joined together. And we believe the same thing about data. The more open it is, the more it works for the people that can use it. So what does data infrastructure include? Well, it could be data assets such as identifiers, registers, data sets, be standards and technologies, guidance and policies that inform the use and management of data, different organizations governing the data, as well as the communities involved in them. So what do we say when we are talking about a data ecosystem? So to understand the ecosystem, we had to talk a little bit about the infrastructure. So when we say a data ecosystem, we say it consists of the data infrastructure and includes the people, the communities, and organizations that both benefit from the value created by the data flowing through the data infrastructure. A data ecosystem map illustrates those value exchanges. Data infrastructure, as we said before, with assets and registers and such, can be hard for people to visualize and understand. So we create tools to help us understand how these ecosystems that it supports enable us to make better decisions. We use this sort of mapping based similar to stakeholder mapping and rich picturing to do so. So within this map of a data ecosystem, helps us understand and explain where data creates value, how it's being shared among different people, different organizations, who stewards it, who benefits from it. So this is sort of why we get into this. We have a report online that anyone is free to access on mapping data ecosystems. And this sort of gives a quick summary of what are the key benefits. So data ecosystem maps help us to visualize, understand, and communicate how data is published, accessed, shared, and used by different people and organizations. We do it to help understand and explain where and how the use of data creates value. We use it to identify the key users and their relationships, and to understand the different roles that different stakeholders can play. A key part of data ecosystems as we see them is about personas. So what do we mean by that? A quick definition is that they are imaginary characters who help us understand the learning needs, the barriers, motivations, and goals of real people. So the personas that we create for our various data ecosystem maps are based on interviews that we conducted in previous projects. So each persona is positioned within the data ecosystem, and they're based on like a composite of different interviews. So doesn't represent a single person, but generally what the needs and barriers and motivations of a particular role entail. So we use this to kind of help show how actual real life roles interact with each other in regards to sharing data and sharing value, both tangible and intangible, throughout a data ecosystem. So we can give a quick example of one as well. So this comes from some of the work we did in our previous project with CABI, creating these user personas. So quickly here is just one we've named Alan. He works for a lead organization, so someone receiving money from a big funder such as Gates or DFID. And so in this particular scenario, Alan works for an agricultural organization that manages a consortium of actors to produce a platform combining data from multiple sources. And as we see here, he has a variety of different characteristics about him. There are what the goals are in Alan as a lead organization, as someone in a lead organization, different pain points, needs, and the different type of data he might collect. We also, in our previous project, created a register of different tools that both we've produced and that are available online that could be used as key learning resources. But mostly we use this to show how they exist within the data ecosystems. Another key way that we've used data ecosystems at the ODI is around mapping for open standards. So open standards is something that we are big proponents of here. So why we found that drawing a data ecosystem map can allow is to help identify where standards would add value, looking at different value exchanges, where different standards might be required, to bring clarity to the scope of a standard by focusing on supporting the specific data flows, to identify stakeholders that will be involved in the process of developing a standard, and to support the engagement by identifying the key stakeholders that engage with launching the particular standard. So we will now look at some different agricultural data ecosystems that we've created in the past using the data ecosystem mapping technique that we worked here on at the ODI. So just a little right before that, this is just some of the feedback that we've gotten that really excited us to hear from our clients at the Gates Foundation. That in none of the grants that they've done that have they ever paid attention to these sort of ecosystem level issues. But now they realize that after using this, it's something that they can't ignore anymore because it'll actually cause problems in the projects that they want to get through. So it's something that we enjoy using ourselves internally, but we found a lot of external benefit from, and has provided a lot of value to our clients. So here we have a generalized data ecosystem, as we call it. So this was produced from our analysis of different sample projects within the Gates Foundation Agriculture Decision-Making Portfolio. So this map shows a typical data ecosystem for a grant-funded agronomy project, although we believe that there could be similarities with other sectors. But by looking across it, we see the different organizations being represented by personas, how they transfer data amongst each other, how we hope to see it transferred, or how it may actually exist right now, and the different types of value that we see coming from it. Now that might be funding, that might be capacity development, that might be different types of information or code. And then we also look at stuff what we call intangible value. So this is more around feedback, knowledge, insights, stuff that maybe not is not data and doesn't maybe produce something that you can see and interact with as easily, but that has value within itself and will still be transferred throughout a data ecosystem. Before we move on to any of the specific ones that we've used in the past, Ruthie, did you want to jump in and say anything more about the generalized data ecosystem?
I'm just getting off of mute. More to say that this is a and I'll go into a little bit more detail about the work that we had done in India, but one of the things that we found is that this was such a great perspective to show people based on that the code that Josh just shared. People began to see so much value in their work and the decisions that they make when they recognize themselves as part of being in the ecosystem. And it's a great way too for people to recognize that the decisions they make aren't just to the people that they see closely around them. You can see the knock-on effects. And so when you're talking about data sharing, especially the data value chain, where data is collected and then it's analyzed and then it's it's shared or it's commercialized, you want to really understand all those different pieces to see how valuable your data can be. But then even if you aren't sharing data with someone else, you want to be able to share back with them, this is how I used it. It would have been better if you had used this format, or we couldn't, I know that you intentionally wanted us to use it, but we couldn't get any value of it from a certain reason. And so it just makes it much more clear that data is not a one direction thing. There are so many ways that you can contribute by connecting yourself with other members of the ecosystem. And by looking at it in a very general way, it makes it quite easy for people to put themselves into those different places. So just because in one project you're a lead organization, you may not always be that. You might be an innovator or you might be a publisher. And so you can sort of see how you fit with different organizations based on the perspective and the role that you have in particular. And I will just go on to my next slides because that's what we did with the work that we did in India. So for this pilot project with the Gates Foundation, where we used data ecosystem mapping, we were specifically trying to identify the barriers to data sharing, access and use in Gates Foundation funded programs. We went in without knowing the system at all, but really wanted to understand, okay, so if someone claims that they have access to data, or they got a grant funded based on access to data, are they actually accessing it? Are they having trouble accessing it? Are they having any trouble using it or giving it to the person that they said they would? And is there a way that we can potentially clarify that? And through data ecosystem mapping, it immediately became very simple. So by just going around talking to different people, asking who do you get data from and share data with, and what are your challenges around that, it became very easy to see what the potential challenges were and what the barriers were. So to the next slide. So this is one of the main things that came out of the work. So one of the things that people often had difficulty with was data quality. So the data existed, they had access to the data, but once they actually tried to do something with it, they found that the quality wasn't what they expected to do what they actually wanted to do with it. And quality in this case looked like a GPS point being in Africa instead of India. And so there was clearly a bunch of data that they couldn't use at all, but then they just started to doubt, like, if the GPS point is wrong here, is it potentially wrong elsewhere? And so they just said it's not something that we could use. Using this data ecosystem mapping technique, we could somewhat pinpoint the area or the organization that a lot of the data quality problems were coming from. You can see that one where there's a lot of arrows coming out of that. And that was particularly helpful for the Gates Foundation because they could identify where the source of the issue was and potentially contribute some support to that. But then if another grantee was to come and say, okay, we're going to use this data, they could say, well, there's lots of other organizations having difficulty, with their data quality. Maybe you should get data from somewhere else, or maybe you should work together with this organization who's trying to clean it. But that is not an insight that they would have been able to have had they not gone through this data ecosystem mapping process. On to the next one. And then this one is around data sharing agreements that existed. And as you can see, out of all of the organizations that are involved in this quite small map, these are the only ones that had data sharing agreements. And so while the others probably were actually sharing data with each other, there wasn't any formalized agreement between the two of them. So they didn't know how they could use it, what the terms of use were, for how long, for what, if there was using it for any commercial use or anything. There weren't these agreements. And so a lot of the discussions that happened there were around, can I use this? Or, they would have to ask in ad hoc ways, which I'm sure many of you in the audience recognize that is not the best way of going about it. And what's important to view this lens through is the FAIR principles. In this project, we were specifically looking through the lens of FAIR principles, not necessarily open, because it makes it much more intentional about who you're actually sharing the data with. And so by using this map, we could ask the FAIR question, we could ask the open question, like, by making your data open, is it getting to this person? And even by sharing your data, is it getting to the person that you're meaning for it to get to? And how do you actually make that very clear that you are an organization sharing with them and they are using it in the way that you expect? And so this was a 6-month pilot. And so from using this approach, this data ecosystem mapping approach, people immediately started having those conversations that they didn't even have the basis to have in the past. That's it from me. Back to Josh.
Thank you very much, Ruthie. So we have some more examples of how this can be used also outside of the agricultural world and how the ODI has used it in the past. So we're looking at 3 specific examples. One is the Transport for London release of transport data, the Leeds bin app. So this is the city Leeds in the UK and the release of data in relation to waste bin collection, as well as the Spend Network, which is a local authority publication of spending data. So here's one sort of nice cleaned up example that we have in our public services report from about a year and a half ago, I believe. And this is trying to show how the Transport for London was publishing open data and how that was being used. Just in case people don't know, Transport for London, or TfL, is a government body that's responsible for all the main routes in London, so the transport system itself, rail networks, buses, taxis, that sort of thing. And publishing open data has been part of their customer information strategy for a long time, and they allow developers on their website to interact with that to create services for other people. So that was done through the route planning map city mapper for this particular example. And as we see in the ecosystem map itself, we see people using public transit services. We see service use generating data, which is then stored and openly published on a unified API. Then this API feeds the TfL website, but also external organizations that create value-add services such as Citymapper, Apple, and Google. For another example, this is sort of like a rough one. Before the ones we showed, we're using a software called Kumu, or a web app called Kumu, which created all the nice circles and lines. The last one was done by our production team, but this sort of thing can be done just by a person sitting down and sketching it out themselves. So in this one, we're showing the specific app called the Leeds Bin app. And it's a mobile application that tells people living in the city of Leeds when different waste bins are due to be collected, and adds reminders in their calendars. So they know, every night to put out the waste bin, that sort of thing, and it includes what to put into which particular one. So again, in this ecosystem app, which is a rough sketching, we have the waste collection data being openly published by the council. We have the app collecting the data and providing useful information to users. Then users using the app itself and providing feedback, and as well as analytics done by the council itself. And the final one I'm going to go over is, again, back to our sort of glossy production, to see that, if you really want to show this in a really snazzy way, it's quite possible to do so, to communicate different ecosystems. So this is about monitoring basically spending by cities and counties, that sort of stuff. So open data being published by government organizations is analyzed and reused in order to make sure that fairness and transparency is happening across the various cities. And then throughout this, we can see local authorities tendering contracts, them openly publishing data, and then the public, including businesses and people in the media, can then see how these taxpayer-funded services are awarded. And this is all shown in this very, very nice map. So now we'll get to the part where we actually talk about how to map a data ecosystem yourself. And usually when we do this, I go through 4 main points. So one is mapping the actors, so plotting all the people, the organizations, and services that are used with the data. Something we call following the data. So now to connect all these various actors, organizations, how are they sharing that data, and drawing that out. Then it's following the insights. So this is kind of looking at different types of value that's being generated in the ecosystem in terms of feedback, the insights, that sort of thing that we mentioned before. And then finding opportunities. So once you've drawn a map, there's actually a lot of opportunity to see, okay, how can we improve the ecosystem that we're working in? Where is data not being shared? Where is value being is not being created, or is being created in places that we didn't really think of before, and how can that be improved? So before you get started, there's usually some sort of activities that we do to prepare people for mapping data ecosystems. It's usually best to do in groups if possible. But last time I gave this webinar, people were asking a lot of questions on, what do I need? How many people should be there? How long is it going to take? So I thought it'd be helpful to quickly go over that ourselves. So I want to make sure you have the right supplies. If you're using pens and paper, that's fine, but Post-it notes are very helpful, and markers on it could be on a whiteboard, it could be on large pieces of paper, what have you. Make sure you have the right people in the room. So it's very rarely in an organization you're going to have one person that knows everything. Well done if you do, but having different people that can bring different information and different perspectives is always helpful to do so as well. And then if you're running a workshop for other people, it's good to have 2 facilitators. So one person can go through more of the theoretical stuff, the other person can help out in a more practical sense. During the workshop, we recommend groups of 3 to 6 people per map, or else it gets a bit cluttered. And then about 1 to 2 hours of workshop time to draw the actual map, and then to write up sort of your findings and discussion points. Usually 2 to 3 rounds of that to go to really understand. And it's always good to start with sort of a use case. Make sure you identify why you're drawing the map. Right? Drawing the map for the sake of it can be nice if you just need to lay things out and see how everything's connected. But if you want to know how a certain policy is affecting various people, or what you need to do to get data from A to B, it's helpful to start from a use case and identify that from the get-go that involves your principal actors. So, step 1, map the actors. We find it helpful to ask certain questions to prompt the knowledge required to do this. So, what role does your organization play? If you start from yourself, it's easier to find out who you're talking to, who you're sharing data with. That who is directly involved in the exchange of data or value. How do different people interact differently? You can look at different types of actors. So, who is stewarding the data? Who's benefiting from the data? Who's contributing to it to create better services? And are there any intermediaries along the way that sort of process data, create derived data, that sort of thing? Next, we want to follow the data. So the easiest thing to do to draw out first is how data is being shared and what each player or actor does with that data. Again, asking yourself different questions. So how is it released? Are you using portals? Are you using just downloads, APIs? What sort of standards are being involved? And from that, we also talk about sort of that tangible data. So who's funding these various data programs? What services are being provided for the data? Making sure that you get back to value creation, as it's a very important part of data ecosystem mapping. After that, as I said before, it's about following the insights. So not everything that's being shared in an ecosystem is something that you can access either digitally or physically, but a lot of it is intangible. So what advice are you getting from people? What insights? Who's using it, and how is that sort of access? Who's talking to whom? Is it being shared reciprocally? And again, how is it being released? Is it via an app that you're getting some new information? Is it an email that you receive that someone telling you something? So having all that within your data ecosystem makes it more robust and makes it more usable when you look back at it later. Of course, the last step, what we always suggest, is to then find opportunities. So could you improve the system? Is what you're looking at right now something that's working well, or is it something that needs to be vastly improved, and can you now see that? Could you use, what sort of ways could you make these improvements? So data standards, for example, will that improve data flows between the actors? What are the impacts of changing how data is accessed, used, and shared? Is it too closed right now? Is it only shared in a one-to-one way? Could opening up that data allow you to get more benefit of it? And then what are the sort of potential users and communities that might benefit from this that are currently not? There's some people that you've missed out that you can see would get a clear value from this. It can also be used to show current and future states. So comparing those two sorts of maps might help you create better decisions. Or you can, as Ruthie showed with her examples from India, focus on different aspects of it. Where are there blockages in data? Where's data sharing agreements, formal agreements happening? So all these different things are possible once you've sort of sketched out that ecosystem itself. And then share them around is also very important. So you may have the right group to create that, but there might be some more knowledge out there. So sharing it around an organization, giving feedback to each other, giving feedback to us. We have our document online, as I mentioned earlier, and we're always welcoming feedback from people who have tried that on their own and want to give us some useful pointers. So it's an open, living document that we're always iterating on. So when it comes to the next step, so once you have that map, you have a bunch of new information really at your fingertips. What's the next step to get more value out of that yourself? So there's sort of 5 main areas that we see when it comes to benefiting from the use of data ecosystem maps. So first one is improving the understanding of an ecosystem. So this helps people understand who's involved and how things are being shared within that ecosystem. Exploring new partnerships. So you identify where an individual or an organization sits within the whole ecosystem and where people are working collaboratively, where there's an ability for people to work more collaboratively, and then where people need to take action to actually make some change within that ecosystem, as you see various actors that have the ability to work together that currently aren't. You can also use it to look at how to access data better, so new sources of data that'll improve your own internal operations, or could possibly power new services that you're thinking of creating or improve existing ones. Or you could just use the map to help understand how to improve a data ecosystem through better data access itself. Can you open up more data? We see that it helps improve projects. So if you're, especially if it's a data-enabled service, and it identifies where projects are repetitive, where gaps are, and how to reach more impact through wider initiatives. And finally, it shows you how to increase impact. It is, a stakeholder map at the same time, so you can identify long-term impact of data and value exchanges on the whole ecosystem. Specifically for agricultural development projects, we've seen a few key benefits that I think are worth talking about independently. So we've seen this used as a communication tool to funders to describe the impact they're having. It can be very opaque if for funding organizations to see, what we give money to these organizations, what's the real value that's happening. And so by using a data ecosystem map, you can draw how funding is moving into a data ecosystem, where that's allowing someone to then share value, and how that shared data and value, and how that data is being transferred into value to end users, such as farmers in the case of the ones that we've looked at. It has helped people understand issues with data sharing. So as Ruthie pointed out before, we have a variety of organizations. Some have formal data sharing agreements, some share data informally, and some are having a lot of trouble receiving or exchanging data between each other. So we can look at that and say, okay, we have an issue there. It's something that we need to specifically tackle. We've used it to build an engagement strategy. So when we know who we need to talk to get certain things done, we use this map as part of a broader engagement strategy to enact that change, and to identify where to introduce solution providers. So once we know where data is being hosted, where it's being shared, where data products exist, we can bring in third parties, bring in innovators to use that data in ways that we think will benefit the end users and the entire ecosystem. So with that, move on to a Q&A. So I don't know, Suchith, if you want to take over at this point and field the various questions for Ruthie and I.
Thank you very much, Josh and Ruthie, for this very helpful and informative webinar. We have some questions coming in. I also want to remind all participants who are online to please use the chat window where you can type in your questions, and we will go through them one by one. So the first question is from Susan Mabanda, who is asking, if farmer wants to access data from a mobile app and finds it is not the right information, and can they point openly that the information was misleading?
I can take that. So yeah, one of the purposes of data ecosystem mapping is making sure that those value loops happen. And so what so often does happen, I think, is an organization is funded to create an app for farmers, and they might do user research to create it for farmers, but then it's funded up until that point. And if farmers are expected to continue using the app and they can't give feedback to the data source, and the program doesn't necessarily exist anymore, or at least isn't funded to get farmers' insights on it, it doesn't have value to the farmer anymore. And so by using data ecosystem maps, you can make it very clear that throughout a project lifetime, throughout a company lifetime, this is an interface that needs to happen. So the farmer needs to give feedback to whoever that this information is wrong. And another thing that comes up that is quite interesting about that question as well is because oftentimes there's the app developer that would be the one that outreaches to farmers, but then the app is populated by data from someone else. And so is it the farmer's responsibility to go to the app developer and tell them that data is incorrect, or can the farmer get to the actual source of the data and tell that person that that's wrong? I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but at least data ecosystem mapping would make it very clear that the farmer needs to be able to give feedback to the organization that is actually collecting the data to make sure that it's suited for the use. And then it also brings up lots of other questions as well to make sure that the data that is available is actually suiting the needs of the farmer. And since those connections oftentimes don't happen, and there might be another series of steps along the pathway, especially if, say, two sources of data are integrated to then give advice to the farmer. There's two sources that that need that feedback that their data is not actually helping the farmer in the way that they want to. And so, yeah, like I said, this process makes it very clear that as part of programs, as part of business plans, the feedback from the farmer back to the data collector is a really essential connection to have. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Ruthie. That is very helpful. The next question
on this,
yeah.
just to add on to that, if you going back to our sort of generalized model, we see that the farmer on the far right here is constantly sending data and also feedback and insights to the various people in the ecosystem. So hopefully something like that would be caught quickly, but this will show you how that system would happen. Sorry, go on, Suchit.
Yes. Sorry. The next question is from Bruce Raza, who is asking, what is the name of the software tool mentioned to create the clear diagrams on slide 25 and 27?
So those ones were done by the ODI in-house production team. So that wasn't this particular software. But the ones that were the software most used throughout this webinar was something called kumu.io. And Kumu is available for both free and paid online, and we find it pretty useful to use for this. But there's plenty of different softwares you can use, and we don't officially advocate for any particular one.
Thank you very much. Another question is from Oluradaro Adigon, who is asking, to what extent is the application of the model to fisheries, and how can my organization benefit from the model?
I would say it's perfectly applicable in the exact same way. It's very sector agnostic as a process. So as shown throughout the presentation, although agriculture was obviously the focus, this also looked at city transit, it looked at waste collection, it looked at government spending. So it can be used in the exact same way throughout. If you just replace the various actors here and technologies, and it's perfectly aligned with fisheries as well. Hi, Suchit. Is there any other questions?
Sorry, it was in mute. In the next question, Camille Cox is asking, in this presentation, you are talking about the data. Does this mean the map is always based on specific set categories of data, for example, ag statistics?
There's no specific data that's used for this. It basically, the purpose is to show how data flows through what we label as an ecosystem, whether that's a specific project, an organization, what have you. So it's not about any specific type of data, it's how data moves and how value is created from that specific data.
Right. Thank you. The next question is from Job Ujavo, who is asking, what are the metrics a farmer needs to consider to forecast agro commodity glut? Metrics, agro commodities. What are the metrics a farmer needs to consider to forecast agro commodities?
I would have to pass that one to Ruthie.
Ruthie,
yeah, I'm not exactly sure either. I'm thinking more about how that the the process could potentially help to answer that question by being clear that this is a need that a farmer has. It's essentially a use case. So by putting the farmers in the middle and asking, okay, what data, what metrics do they need to be able to serve this purpose? It just makes it very clear that these are the sources of information. It needs to get to the farmer in this way by this time,
Right.
in order for them to make a well-informed decision. So I would say that I personally can't answer that question, but that question can be answered by using this process.
Right. Thank you. Another question from Zakaria Abdullah is asking how the data ecosystem mapping support the fair data principles. Maybe some of you already mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, it shows whether it can show whether or not data is findable and accessible and interoperable and reusable by showing how data is currently being used in an ecosystem. So if data is not being shared between two organizations, you can then explore that to see, is one organization able to find or access the data? Is the reason the data is not being turned into value because it's not interoperable based on standards or interoperable or reusable based on standards or anything like that? So it won't tell you right off the bat necessarily, but it gives you the opportunity to then investigate those sorts of things. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Ruthie.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's helpful with the FAIR principles framing that's different than the open framing is that FAIR is very intentional about who it is for. So findable for who, accessible for who, interoperable with what, reusable to who. And I think that data ecosystem mapping helps to answer those questions. Because if you say, my data is fair, and you can't answer those questions to who or who it should be fair to, even if it's everyone, then it's really hard to measure if you are actually being fair. Whereas various people that we've worked with using this map and we go through the FAIR principles with them, we can very clearly ask, who do you want your data to be findable by? What organization do you want your data to be interoperable with? And then those are two connections, and you figure out what is the relationship currently between them and what do you want the relationship to be between them. Yeah, and it becomes very easy to build it out there, because you could say, I want my data to be interoperable with theirs, but I don't want to, I don't want to share my data with them, or I don't want them to reuse it. You can be very intentional about that, using the FAIR principles through a lens to view data ecosystem mapping.
Thank you, Ruthie. Do you want to add anything, Josh, on that?
No, I think that's been covered. Thanks.
So I think the next question is from Chris Addison, who is asking, do you see the mapping as useful for drawing up codes of conduct of data exchange, particularly including value exchange?
I think it can be helpful. So by codes of conduct, you're referring to something like a data sharing agreement. Yeah, I think it can give you a good perspective on what data might be needed and why, and who needs that particular data. So I think it'll be a useful tool in creating those sorts of data governance or data sharing regimes. And if anything else you want to add on that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's something that we're doing right now, actually, and that is one of the processes that one of our partner grantees is working on. They realized that they were running into a lot of those issues of not having those, I mean, if you are talking about data sharing agreements, those sort of codes of conduct, codes of use with other organizations. And what we've done with them is put them in the middle, and all of their people they're getting data from, sharing data with, all around, and then prioritizing, okay, which data do you really need and is essential to your platform? If you don't have it, your platform won't work. Okay, let's create formalized data sharing agreements with them. And then exactly, you can tell them that, through your data, these are going to be the users. You can answer a lot of the questions that potentially come up about, how are you going to use this, for how long, for what purpose, how quickly do you need it, etc. It just becomes very easy to have those conversations when putting it onto these maps. And yeah, that's something that we're currently doing.
Thank you, Ruthie. There's one comment from Susan Mabanda, who is telling that brings about the pathways for communication, the source, target, and feedback. It can help when trying to identify the right pathways. So any
Yeah, that's exactly it. I would say that one of the biggest benefits we've found from data ecosystem mapping is it makes, I mean, I'm sure so many of you in the audience work in these extremely complex systems. And it's so easy to get bogged down by the number of partners, the number of interactions, and what they're actually important for. And so by breaking it down, having a methodology to actually get it all out really helps to sort through the complexity and, as you say, create the right pathways to figure out where the opportunities are.
Thank you, Ruthie. Another question, Oludare Adigon is asking, is it possible to have access to the software or the apps? I'm not, I don't know exactly understand what exactly is asking Oludare. So maybe he might be meaning the tools you use to create the figures.
So Kumu is freely accessible online. So yeah, if he types in KUMU into Google or KUMU.io into his web browser, then he'll be able to work on that immediately.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think
yeah,
that's
they're free to use. Yeah, it's free to use. Most of our maps in there are just screenshots of the system. You just need a log on and a password. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
Great, thank you. And I just want to also remind all the participants that because we have recording this webinar, we will make sure after the webinar we will share the recordings with all of you, and hopefully, even if it will help those who are not able to attend today to listen to this helpful webinar, and we'll have the discussions through our mailing list as well. So if you have any questions specific, you can either email Ruthie or Josh on specific queries, and they'll be more than happy to answer them. And we can send their email addresses later when we send the recording, so that you can ask any specific questions to them directly as well. Is that okay, Josh?
Yes, absolutely. And on top of that, so we'll be sharing this presentation, and I'll show you now. It has our our names on it with the contact info, and as well there's a little bit of on tools and reports. So these are different things that we've developed here at the ODI that we believe would be helpful for anyone that's doing data ecosystem mapping and or works in that space, similar to what we've been talking about so far this webinar.
Oh, fantastic. I think this tools and reports, again, there are so many resources. I just saw this using geospatial data gate licenses, and I think there are a lot of these information, because we have the most of our colleagues in this particular working group are from the agriculture community. This will be really a lot of useful for them to look into these resources and then come back to you for any other queries or any further information you have. And can I ask one question on, because I saw this using geospatial data. So what was the background of this? Was it like a report you produced for this project, or was it for another project?
So it wasn't for this project. This is part of a larger innovation project that we were working on with the UK government, and it basically looks at how licensing impacts reuse of commonly sourced UK geospatial data. So it's more UK specific, but it's very applicable from a sort of not technical, but more cerebral way to look across how geospatial data might benefit users of it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's really helpful. So the links are all in that in this slide. So I will also make sure I look into this, and I will and I'm sure other colleagues who have interest in different areas on this these very interesting topics, please go through these resources. So if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask through the chat window. We have a couple more minutes before we finish. So I have one question for both of you, Ruthie and Josh. So from your experience on this project, for example, in India, when we started working with the organizations, how difficult was it to for them to start this process, or was it like, did you have to go through some stages to make them understand the importance of this?
So not really, to be honest. So when we first when we did the pilot project, it was a proof of concept. So
Right.
we didn't necessarily do data ecosystem mapping with the target users. They knew exactly what we were creating, and we shared it back with them. But we were just testing it out to see. And then since we've restarted this 2-year funded project, which started just this February, the uptake and the value has been quite quick. As I mentioned before, the trying to get past the complexity of the problem, this is a great way of tackling that. And so even if you're talking to people who are somewhat skeptical about fair data or open data, just as a way to sort through the complexity, it's a really good tool to use. It could be just as well used as being clear that you don't want to share data with this organization, but again, it's a way of being clear about it. I'm not sure if, Josh, you've had any other experiences with any others who've been reticent to use the tool, but we haven't. We've had people who have had other challenges, but around the tool, around the data ecosystem mapping process itself, not necessarily any issues.
Yeah, in my experience, it's been a very useful way, and again, both across different sectors, working, even in sensitive places like healthcare, it's been a very helpful and very sort of opening way to communicate and talk about data and data sharing.
Thank you, Josh. So one of the participants has requested that, can you please show the contact info slide again? I think if you could show that your email slide, so they can.
Yeah. So that just my name and at theodi.org, and if you go on any of some of the resources, my contact info will be there as well. The contact info of all ODI staff is on our website as well.
Thank you very much. I think, go on, Ruthie.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, do please share with us your maps. If you do create them, we are happy to give feedback. Happy to give
absolutely
guidance. And it's just great to get any sort of feedback on what you found useful or not, and ways that the guide can be tailored. But even though we've been quite clear in how we're showing how it can be used in many different ways as well. So doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to data. You could show funding flows. It could be used in any sort of user research. So be creative and let us know what you do.
Thank you very much, Ruthie and Josh, for this very informative webinar, and thank you for sharing this excellent presentation with all of us today. I also want to thank all the participants who joined us today and the very lively discussions, and contributing these excellent questions for this webinar. I want to specifically thank our colleagues in CTA, Chipo Messingini and Chris Addison, who have been hosting our webinars, and other colleagues in CTA who make this webinars possible. As I informed before, this webinar is recorded, so we will make sure we will send the webinar recording later, and we will also publish it in the CTA's YouTube channels for other colleagues who want to listen to this webinar. And you are more than welcome to contact the presenters for any specific questions or any queries you have on the topic, and they'll be more than happy to answer you as well. So we will continue the discussions on this topic through the GODAN capacity development mailing list for those of you who are interested to follow up on any of the capacity development activities. So thank you all for joining today, and thanks for the presenters, Ruthie and Josh, for your time and for your inputs for today. So see you all next time. Bye for now.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.